At 08 Wars on January 24th, 1945, the world on that frozen ridge near the town of Houssen, France, went from uneasy quiet to pure hell in the span of a breath. The fog that had sat low over the fields like a blanket for hours began to thicken, then to part, and through that parting something monstrous emerged. 6 marked the 6. Tiger tanks, hulking silhouettes of steel and menace, their 88mm cannons already thudding. And behind them, a screaming tide of 600 SS mountain troops, shock troops, fanatic, well-trained, and lethal. For the American 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry, what began as a morning watch turned in seconds into an annihilation. Trees exploded like matchsticks, snow turned to steam and blood. Men who had been joking minutes before were gone in unseeable seconds. On a small rise, in a shallow ditch 300 yards forward of his own line, a man watched and made a decision that would bend the course of those minutes into legend. He was 25 years old, a lieutenant by battlefield commission, a farm boy from Clinton County, Kentucky. He stood 5'3" and weighed barely 112 pounds. He was sick with severe dysentery, wounded, hollowed out by months of combat, and he was not supposed to be where he was. His name was Garlin Murl Conner. He had been pulled off the front, made an intelligence officer, and sent to a relatively safe command post 2,000 yards to the rear. His new job was supposed to be maps, reports, and survival. Instead, true to a habit that had already carved his small frame into legend among the men who had seen him work, Conner had been slipping back to the line, crawling into no man's land, lying in the snow to watch, seeing what the generals in their warm tents could not. That morning, he had a field telephone in his hand, the thin lifeline that threaded back 300 yards to artillery headquarters. And he had a feeling he could not ignore. The air was wrong. It was too quiet, the kind of silence that feels like the breath before a heart attack. He told the command post, "They're coming, it's today. Get ready." They told him to get some sleep. Reports showed nothing. Then he heard it, a far-off clank, the metallic heartbeat of tracked vehicles. The fog dissolved and revealed the nightmare advancing across the fields. 6 Tiger tanks, 600 SS, not probing, not testing. They were attacking straight through the weakest point in the American line, the very point Conner had been warning them about. The first shells ripped the American line apart. The 88mm rounds turned earth into geysers of ice and splinters. American machine guns chattered helplessly against thickened steel. Men were flung into the air like rag dolls. The line started to break. The green replacements, the tired veterans, the sleepy sentries, began to reel and run. Conner watched his men, and he counted 60 seconds. In a minute, that line, the thin thread that kept their battalion alive, would be gone. He had the telephone receiver in his hand. He had a spool of wire. He had a choice most soldiers never face. Follow doctrine and save yourself. Retreat to the command post, or do something so reckless it violated every training manual, every rule, every survival instinct. He ran toward the maelstrom. He ran away from safety and into open fire, straight into the cacophony of machine guns and the thunder of tanks. He ran not to escape, but to become the target, to put himself into the only place that could steer the thunder back where it needed to go. Over 3 years of war had taught him the math of survival and destruction. He knew the blast radii, the timing, how to make the guns walk. He also knew what the men at the guns could not, where the enemy would come, which coordinates would break the attack, which slice of frozen ground to pour hell over, so that an advancing cadre of armored gods and screaming shock troops would not pass. He unspooled the wire, found a shallow crater, lay himself down in the snow 250 yards forward of his lines, and called the artillery commander. The man in the rear, listening to a map and to the theory that doctrine was truth, asked simply, nervously, "Sir, what are you doing? Get out of there." Connor's voice was the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime reading weather off the sky. Calm, patient, cold. "I am 200 yards from the enemy. They are all around me," he said. Then he spoke the words that split the scene. "Sir, bring the artillery directly on me." To an artillery officer, orders like that bristle with every taboo. You do not call danger close to yourself. You do not ask a commander to throw tons of metal inside the ring of your own troops. You never set your own coordinates as the strike point. And yet there, in a crater, with tiger tracks steaming in the distance, and SS voices like a living river, Conner argued his arithmetic and his read of the field. He told the commander that 300 yards behind him was the safety buffer, and that if the artillery stayed out, they had 5 minutes before the line popped, and the Germans would be through. The artillery officer hesitated, almost refused, the crackle of doctrine against the raw evidence coming from the man with snow in his beard. When you have an observer on the ground who is willing to speak with the certainty of a farmer who knows the land, and when you hear the desperation in the voice that has seen the forms of the enemy and feels their weight 100 yards away, you can choose reason, or you can choose to trust the man in the hole. The commander trusted Conner that morning. Range confirmed. Firing solution. Shells on the way. Conner did not flinch. He listened to the ranging shots fall dangerously close behind him, too far from the target. He told them to bring the fire in, then closer, nearer, until the puffs of earth and ice were within 50 yards. The sound of artillery dropped like a rain of knives. Razor-sharp shrapnel began to zip overhead and past his face, slicing the air like 1,000 small betrayals. He was inside his own kill zone. He lay there and picked targets. The first Tiger that had been tearing their line to shreds stood 200 yards north of his position, lumbering, firing into the battalion's command post. Conner put the receiver to his mouth and said, "Target, Tiger, 200 yards north. Fire for effect." The guns obeyed. A wave of high explosive began to walk across the snow, a controlled storm that blanketed the tank and the cluster of SS around it. When it struck, the lead Tiger shuddered, then burned. The roar of its engines grew thin and then silent. For the German officers watching, this was nonsense. The heavens themselves seemed to be aiding this ragged American line. They had expected retreat and a rout. Instead, they watched men and metal disappear under a storm of their own making. Panic is a contagious thing on the battlefield. It spreads faster than bullets. When Conner began to peel leaders and machine guns and radio men from the German formations, men who had been shouting orders or trying to assemble MG-42s simply no longer existed where they had been. Conner's calls were surgical. He targeted MG-42 teams, the small bands that lent a unit its bite. He called for officers by sight. Target, officer, left flank, 250 yards. Whichever ordnance fell on the call took them out of the battle at the point where command mattered. Without leaders, momentum collapses. The SS men, fanatics to be sure, willing to die where many would, found themselves bereft of guidance. The artillery was not an anonymous, blind bombardment. It was a surgeon's hand, because the surgeon, the spotter, was in the hole. The German major, a veteran of Eastern battlefields who thought himself immune to surprise, screamed into his radio that this had to be American spotters. The Americans were retreating, so it must be a lucky shell. But it wasn't luck. For 2 hours, the ghost in the field, a man almost too small to have lifted a rifle, a man who had swallowed dysentery and still found the strength to move steel with his words, managed the only possible resource that could stop an infantry armored blow: precise, crushing artillery. The Germans reacted like any commander in extremis. They tried to search for the observer. They ordered their mortars to clear the grid square, to fire on the suspected coordinates. They sent their third and fourth Tigers to hunt ditches and craters. For 2 hours, Conner lay in a crater as his world convulsed. American 105mm rounds hammered 50 yards in front of him. German 81mm mortars burst 100 yards behind. Shrapnel chewed the air into a buzzing physical pressure. A German mortar came screaming and landed 10 yards from his hole. The concussion lifted his small body and slammed it back to the ground. Pain exploded through his old wounds. New shrapnel lodged in his hip. He spat blood and snow and put his hand to it, felt the hot stick of pain, and crawled back into the crater. He whispered into the receiver again and again. Target that mortar position. Silence them. The mortars went quiet. He guided the guns like a conductor, stopping one advance, crippling another Tiger that tried to flank, breaking entire formations by knocking out the ordnance and officers they depended on. This was not an act of blind heroism. There was method in his madness. He had been doing this for years. At Anzio, he had crawled across open ground under a hail of bullets to kill a machine gun crew at 15 yards. He had crawled into minefields to clear a path inch by inch with his bayonet. He had stormed houses, flanked snipers, and dragged wounded officers to safety under shell fire. The list of citations piled like an impossible inventory. Multiple silver stars, bronze stars, purple hearts. By December 1944, his body was taxed beyond the ledger of medals. He had been wounded, fevered, a man hollowed by attrition and infection. Yet his mind kept the battlefield clearest of all. That morning, his knowledge of range and blast radius, his old farmer's geometry, the way soil yields and how metal speaks when it falls, was the difference between surviving and the Germans punching clean through. But the field is a fluid thing, and the machine is never perfect. After hours of coordinated terror, an 88mm shell from a hunting Tiger sliced across the field and severed Conner's telephone line, the thin copper umbilical that had kept the guns listening to his voice. The receiver went dead. Silence swallowed the artillery commander's headset. For a shocked moment, the guns stopped. The Germans heard the pause and roared, "The observer is dead. Push forward." Their commanders ordered a final surge. The last 3 Tigers rose, engines raw, and the SS screamed on their heels. Conner lay in the crater, bleeding, the wire broken like a snapped promise trailing off into the churned field. He could stay in his hole and die. He could surrender. He could be crushed under the weight of men and metal. Instead, he did what he had always done. He crawled. He left his hole and went on his belly, dragging the broken wire behind him across a battlefield that had become a theater of death and witnesses. The SS and the Americans both fired when a moving shape showed itself in the snow. A machine gunner on the American line saw a figure and opened up. German rifles joined in. Tracer fire stitched the air around his head. He crawled over the bodies of the men he had forced into the snow. He felt the cold bite his hands, which were turning to claws from frost and blood. Blood soaked his trousers. His hip became a mass of rearranged flesh and bone. Somewhere ahead of him lay the other end of the telephone, a crater 100 yards from the American line. He dove into it, numb fingers fumbling. He produced his knife, tried to strip insulation with hands that would not obey. The cold had stolen most feeling. He dropped the knife. He dropped the wires. The Germans were 150 yards away. The Tigers were still firing. His own men from the line were peppering his crater because, in the frozen haze, he looked like a German scout. He gathered the wires, dragged them to his mouth, and began to strip the rubber with his teeth when his hands would not work. He chewed, and bled, and bled, and chewed. The copper flashed, alive. He held the 2 live copper strands in his frozen, shredded hand, and the wire crackled. At the end of the dead receiver, someone heard it, a whisper of life in the snowy roar. The artillery commander, who had been screaming into a black line, heard a faint voice. "Fire!" The guns roared back to life. Conner, still lying in the open, still 100 yards from his men, gave the last order. All guns, 75 yards in front of me. Fire! Fire! Fire!" There are moments in war when precision becomes an irrelevant luxury, and annihilation becomes the blunt instrument of survival. That was such a moment. 18 guns, hungry, and re-aimed, unleashed everything with one directive: make the ground between Conner and his men uninhabitable. They stopped trying to surgically pick targets. They swept the earth clean. The sky above that 75-yard strip became an apocalyptic one, a preternatural wall of smoke, fire, and falling metal. The SS charge hit it and simply ceased to exist as a coherent formation. Hundreds fell in the space of heartbeats. Men who had been advancing with a scream were suddenly only bodies on snow. The last Tigers, their crews stripped of infantry support, burned and whirled and, terrified and ripped, turned away. They retreated. The charge, the thing that had threatened to cleave that battalion in two, ended not with a rout of Americans, but as a burning, stunned withdrawal of Germans. Silence drew down over the field like another fog. Conner let go of the wires. The receiver went dead once more. He pushed himself up. He was covered in blood and soot. His uniform hung in tatters, his hip a shattered monument to what he had done. He walked back to his lines as if walking across his own harvest, every step a proof of the life he had purchased with pain. Men who had been firing at him stopped. They stared as a small figure ghosted through the mist, past the buckled front line, past Lieutenant Colonel Smith, who had run up to the edge and watched the form limp by. "Murl, my God, I thought you were dead," Smith said, his voice thin. Conner passed him the broken receiver and said in a rasp, "I had to fix the wire." Then he collapsed into the snow. The medics saw him and descended. He was a small man in the arms of the army, nothing theatrical, a human sack of wounds and winter. The sight was so raw that the line, a cluster of weathered, exhausted soldiers, could only stand, silent, watching the miracle of a man they had presumed lost survive, and speak with the calm that had guided them through the storm. When patrols later went out into the frozen churn that had been the target of Conner's desperate symphony, what they found was a field that no one living wanted to look upon twice. The snow had been dented into a moonscape of bodies and blackened craters. The artillery Conner had called had been so precise, so merciless, it had left little in the way of wounded. There were the dead, the burning hulks of 3 Tigers, 3 more crippled or abandoned, and an unimaginable count of German bodies. They found more than 50 SS killed, hundreds more wounded, and trampling, pulling themselves back into retreat. The attack of 600 men and the 6 monster tanks had been halted and broken, not by numbers or doctrine, but by the actions, stubborn, methodical, and utterly singular, of one small man with a broken field telephone and an unbending will. The immediate accounting is simple: lives saved, lines held, tanks down. But the story that follows is the one war always invents for its quiet miracles: the derangement of bureaucracy. Lieutenant Colonel Smith wrote the report. He wrote the recommendation for the Medal of Honor, with a pen that shook from the adrenaline and the truth he had seen. He described the 3 hours of a man calling artillery onto his own position, of a man crawling forward and then back, of the broken wire, of the chewing of the insulation with teeth. He begged the chain to recognize what had been done. But the chain, in the comfortable safety of headquarters, had paperwork and doctrine to defend. The report, so improbable it sounded like a movie, met the first filter of disbelief. A 5'3" lieutenant who had already earned a catalog of valor, 4 silver stars, multiple bronze stars, Purple Hearts, could not be the instrument of such a surreal triumph. It is one thing to read bullets and another to read papers. Empathy is thinner on those who have not bled. The report, Smith's impassioned plea, vanished into the bureaucracy of a military system already full of heroism and tired of miracles. The war was winding down. Men were being sent home. The file cabinet is merciless in its indifference. Even the most incandescent pages can be shuffled into the wrong drawer. Conner was sent to a hospital. He was given his 4th Purple Heart and the Distinguished Service Cross. He was thanked formally, given the small consolation of medals, and a ride toward civilian life. The rest, the Medal of Honor that would have been a nation's most thunderous recognition, did not come. What happens to men who have been the deadliest and most necessary in a war when the war ceases to need them? Garlin Murl Conner, the ghost from the snow, went home. He went back to the small Kentucky farm that had taught him to read the sky and to know the weight of winter. He married Pauline, planted Rose, and lived with the kind of quiet that does not want attention. The shrapnel in his hip stung every winter like a memory that never cooled. He did not write memos or chase medals. He did not speak long about what he had done. Neighbors saw the Distinguished Service Cross. They saw his silver stars. They did not see the rest of the story because he did not tell it. For decades, the ghost remained a small man blessing a small life. But history is stubborn. A man named Richard L.M. Lynch, a fellow veteran of the 3rd Division and a Kentuckian like Conner, refused to let the story die in a dusty file. In 1995, 50 years after that January morning, Lynch began a new campaign. Not with guns, but with patience and paper. He dug through archives. He pulled at the threads no one else had expected to find. He discovered the original lost report written by Colonel Smith, hidden in a file and ignored for half a century. He found the artillery logs with coordinates that matched the scene. He found German after-action reports that showed a collapsed battalion and burning Tigers, corroborating what the wary men on the American side had seen. He found surviving witnesses who could still, in creaky voices, point to the place on a map where a small man had fixed a wire with his teeth. When Lynch reassembled the evidence and put it before a modern army that had the bandwidth to listen and the humility to be startled, the impossibility no longer looked like fiction. The new experts read the old reports and the logs, and they believed. They admitted the bureaucracy had been wrong. They did what could be done belatedly. They corrected the record. By then, Conner was 79, a frail figure in a hospital bed in Kentucky. When the call came, it was not from a field telephone, but from the highest office in the land. The president called and told him, finally, that the nation had recognized what was done all those years ago. The Medal of Honor, at last, was to be his. He was too sick to travel. He died 2 months later, in March of 1998. The medal was presented to his widow Pauline in a ceremony at the White House, a nation's apology and thanks wrapped in a ribbon that could not erase the decades, the pain, the silences. It was, of course, late. But for those who watched the ghost walk back across the line, it mattered that the truth had been fought for and, eventually, acknowledged. In the ledger of wars, there are figures that generals can summarize in columns. Tanks lost, fronts held, miles taken. But sometimes a single act bends a ledger. Sometimes survival is not won by tacticians in rooms, but by the stubborn calculations and the merciless courage of a single man who knows, intimately, the precise distance between death and safety. Garlin Murl Conner was not a soldier who sought fame. He was a farmer who fought like a man who had nothing left to lose but everything to give. His story is not tidy. It is brutal and human and, at times unspeakably violent. It is also a parable of how institutions react to things that do not fit their categories. They disbelieve, they misfile, they forget. But it is also a testament to the way memory works when memory is stubborn, to the friends who refuse to let their deeds be buried, and to the long, slow persistence of truth. In the end, Conner is measured not only by medals, 4 silver stars, 3 bronze stars, 4 Purple Hearts, the Distinguished Service Cross, and finally, the Medal of Honor, but by the men who lived because he was willing to be the target. He bought hours for his battalion with his bones. He orchestrated death on his own body so others could live. He refused a safe route because the safe route would have left hundreds murdered and a front ripped open. He fixed a broken wire with his teeth, and, in so doing, he wired a line from the violence of that day into the conscience of a nation that had been slow to notice. The nuances in this story matter. This was not blind heroism. Conner's mind was precise. He knew distances, shell patterns, where to place the sky's metal to break a formation's will. He was also a man of contradictions, a small, broken soldier who could direct the death of hundreds by the grammar of mathematics, and a man who paid for victory by being broken further. He came home to plant seeds. He never sought to be mythologized. He was not a figure in a parade. He was a quiet man who did what had to be done. The larger truth is that wars make heroes by accident and reward them by bureaucracy's clock. It took a half-century and the stubborn workers in dusty rooms to set the record right. But those who were there, the silent medics, the staring machine gunners, the colonel who ran with a shaking hand to file a recommendation that was nearly swallowed by formality, never doubted. They had watched a small figure rise out of a crater, hand the broken instrument to his commander, say a single sentence about fixing the wire, and then fall into the snow. They had watched him get up and walk back toward them with his uniform in shreds and his face streaked with smoke and ice. They had stood in the cold and watched a man who had every reason to save himself choose to endanger himself because he believed it would save them. That belief is simple and savage. The only way home is through the enemy. It is a farmer's logic. It is cold, practical, and terrible in its clarity. In the end, history offers us a small and stubborn mercy, that the dead are not always left forever unnamed, that the men who choose the worst possible path for the rest of us sometimes have their names recalled and their deeds told. Garlin Murl Conner's story lives in the burned-out hulks found in that field, in the medical reports and the artillery logs, in the faded ink of a recommendation that finally reached the ears it should have reached. It lives in the small Kentucky farm that kept his hands busy when the world would no longer need his courage. And it lives in the uncomfortable truth it forces on institutional minds. That doctrine is a tool, not a god, and that sometimes survival depends on those who are willing to step outside the book and call down the guns onto their own bodies for the salvation of others. If you listen to the winter wind across a hill, you can hear it whisper that single stubborn fact, that sometimes one unassuming man can change the outcome of a field simply by refusing to move back. The medals and ceremonies and late honors are not the point. The point is the act itself. A man in a crater in the snow, chewing a wire with his teeth, calling fire on himself, and in those 3 brutal hours turning annihilation into survival for an entire battalion. That is grit, in its most unromantic and most absolute form. That is why, even after the files are lost and found in the general's debate, the story matters, because when you strip away the language of doctrine and glory, all that remains is a human choice made under the loudest possible proof that it would end badly for him. He chose it anyway.